So our speaker today is GC alum, Dr. Ignacio Montoya. Dr. Ignacio Montoya is an assistant professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. He earned his PhD in linguistics at the City University of New York. For his dissertation, he offered a novel analysis of word structure in Hebrew, Navajo, and Spanish using a theoretical approach that challenged basic assumptions of the dominant framework of the field. Ignacio's current research interests focus on the intersection of linguistic theory, language revitalization and reclamation, and decolonization. Since arriving in Reno in 2017, he has been studying Numu, or Northern Paiute, and has been working with members of the Native American community to preserve and fortify the local indigenous languages. Prior to embarking on his doctoral program, Ignacio was an elementary and middle school teacher working in a variety of classroom settings in Los Angeles and New York City. He remains strongly committed to education at all levels as a means of empowering marginalized communities. So, without further ado, I turn the floor over to you, Ignacio.
Thank you, Aiden, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak. So, as you mentioned, I'm a GC alum, and I have really fond memories of my time at the Graduate Center. So it's really great to be able to be here now, even if it's virtual. So maybe at another time, I will be able to take in the New York City vibes in person. So the title of my talk today is Interrogating the Colonial Legacy of Linguistics and Adopting Principles of Decolonization. And let's see. The talk that I'm going to be presenting is based on a chapter that I've written for Decolonizing Linguistics, which is part of a 2-volume series along with Inclusion in Linguistics that's soon to be published by Oxford University Press. This series is edited by Anne Charity Hudley, Christine Mallinson, and Mary Buchholz, and these 3 individuals have done a lot of work with social justice issues in linguistics. So this is really what this talk is about, and this is really what the series is about in my chapter. And specifically, I'm doing some reflecting on some of the things that I've learned by engaging with these ideas of decolonization. And so in particular, I'm focusing on work with indigenous communities, and my work has been particular to the United States context, so Native American communities. And I do hope that these ideas are sort of more generally applicable as we think about ways of making linguistics more expansive, more equitable, and thinking about some of the structures that maybe we are not interrogating very often, and thinking about what that might mean if we opened up possibilities. So I'm going to start by contextualizing myself, and I do this for 2 reasons. One is this seems to be part of indigenous practice. Certainly, if you go to indigenous gatherings, you'll hear people introducing themselves about where they come from and basically situating themselves geographically. And I think this is important for giving recognition to the history of a particular place. But I think it's also important because it signals that our work is not necessarily completely neutral. We seem to have this idea, in general, the academics seem to have an idea that the work that we do is separated from the personal experiences of the researchers. And I think that really our own trajectories inform the kinds of research questions, theories, and methodologies that we embark upon, which I'll talk about actually a little bit with myself in the next slide. But in terms of where I am literally coming to you from, I'm in Reno right now, which is in the northwestern part of the state of Nevada. And this is in the Great Basin area, which is a geographic area. It's a geologic, land formation type area, but also there's something that's distinctive culturally, and it has a distinctive history as well. And this is true both for indigenous communities, but also just for, the settler communities that are here now. And as I mentioned, I do work with indigenous languages. And so I wanted to mention the languages that are indigenous to this area. So one of them is Numu, or Northern Paiute, which is the language that I've sort of worked most closely with. And the other one that's sort of indigenous to this particular part of the country, to the Reno area, is Washoe, which is spoken by an indigenous community that's centered on Lake Tahoe, which is about 45 minutes from Reno. So I'll talk a little bit about my trajectory because, as I said, I think that it's important for us to recognize that our own personal contexts do, in fact, influence the choices that we make about our research. And I think it's important to have a certain level of transparency in that, because I think that's informative for people that are evaluating our work or trying to understand our frameworks, that there isn't this sort of pure objectivity, but rather everything that we do is informed by our personal experiences. So, as Aidan mentioned, I am a product of the Graduate Center, a proud product of the Graduate Center. I was there from 2010 to 2017 in the PhD program in linguistics. My work there, so my dissertation was on morphological constituents, and I chose to do an analysis of Hebrew, Navajo, and Spanish, and I can certainly defend those choices on linguistic grounds in terms of their structure. But again, these choices were also informed in part by my own personal experiences and knowledge of these languages. I also did a lot of community engaged work while I was there. I volunteered for the Endangered Language Alliance. I was, as part of my dissertation, I went to the Navajo Nation to the Navajo Language Academy, and that's where I connected with Indigenous communities. And I think one thing that I'll mention about the Graduate Center that I'm aware of now that I've gone away is that really the Graduate Center has a reputation among other scholars for being innovative with regard to social justice, to issues of inclusion. And it's something that I now see in myself when I compare myself to other scholars who have been at other institutions, that is part of who I am, is this product of the Graduate Center, which is centered on public education, which is centered on engagement with communities. And again, that has shaped the kinds of choices that I have made. So I started in 2017 as an assistant professor at the University of Nevada in the English department. And although the job call was for they were looking for someone that did structural analysis, so syntax or morphology. My dissertation was on morphology. I have been teaching a lot of classes on syntax since I've gotten here, but they were also interested in expanding what they do. And so they also had desired experience with endangered languages and Native American languages. So that informed the way that I proceeded with my research agenda when I got here. I figured that if I was going to be working on Indigenous languages, I really should be working on the Indigenous languages of this area. And that was for two reasons. One is, it's expedience. It makes it easier for me to work with communities here. But there was also this kind of ethical motivation for me that if I was going to be living in this territory, in this land, and I had a particular set of skills, that I wanted to serve the people that I was connected with in community. So I made the deliberate choice to work on Northern Paiute, not so much for linguistic reasons, but really for these reasons of ethical type of reasons. And I also decided to start by simply connecting with the communities, that I knew that I wouldn't be able to do this work without having relationships. So I started by just attending classes at one of the local reservations on Northern Paiute and just attending events. At the same time that was happening, as I mentioned, I am in an English department. So I became exposed to these ideas through these interdisciplinary connections. So through people that were in English, so in literary studies, rhetoric and composition, but also through other colleagues that I met in the gender race identity program and in anthropology. And this is the first time that I was exposed to the idea of decolonization. It's probably not the first time I actually heard that term or heard that idea. But it's the first time that it registered for me. And part of it is because it seemed to be something that was in the air for people in adjacent disciplines. And as a result, these factors, my training at the Graduate Center with a sort of social justice orientation, the fact that I decided to work on Indigenous languages of the area with a deliberate, this was a conscious, mindful choice, and the fact that I was being exposed to these theoretical ideas have shaped the work that I've done that's going to lead to the presentation that I'm going to give today. So I would say that my current work is at the intersection of linguistic theory, language revitalization, and decolonization. So what do I mean by decolonization? Well, first of all, I think you should be asking me that question, and you should be asking anybody that question who does work with decolonization or who uses that term. So as I said, for myself, I was exposed to that idea, or at least it first registered for me when I started here at UNR. And since then, I've really seen an explosion in the use of that term, both in academia. So a lot of fields are starting to use it, including linguistics. but also more generally in popular culture. I don't know if you've seen Reservation Dogs, which is on Hulu, and sorry to put a sort of a plug for a TV show, but it's really exceptionally well done. It captures sort of the Indigenous experience, especially of young people, I think in a way that's really compelling. And they had a chapter an episode recently on decolonization. So because decolonization is in the air in this way, I think it's important for us to clarify what we mean by that. So here's sort of my understanding. So for me, decolonization, broadly speaking, is the undoing of the effects of colonization. It's a process designed to shed and recover from the ill effects of colonization. So for myself, it's based on an understanding as it's understood in Indigenous studies. So I've talked to African-American scholars who also use that term decolonization, and for them, it's based on different types of experiences. They have different ideas. So my own experiences come from the communities that I work with. So it is through Indigenous studies, my scholarly engagement with it. And there are two key ideas that I want to draw from that will be sort of part of this presentation. So one of them is that decolonization involves recognizing and valuing Indigenous knowledge, needs, and priorities. And the other is that inherent to some understandings of decolonization is a return of resources and control. So there's the land back movement, which is actually an activist movement. And it's really talking about giving back, not so much actual land, because land as property is not necessarily consistent with a lot of Indigenous conceptualizations of the relationship of people and land, but rather giving a stewardship to Indigenous people, letting Indigenous voices be part of the management of land. So there is this idea of giving back that I think is a part of decolonization. That's something that's going to inform the way that I am thinking about what it means for me to try to do decolonial work in linguistics, which again I'll continue to reference throughout the presentation. So I think that one of the key ideas of that I think is important for us to grapple with is that the academy, universities, other institutions of learning have been a key part of colonialism throughout the history of colonization throughout the world. And part of that is because the devaluation of Indigenous knowledge systems has been central to colonization. That's one of the key points of the colonial agenda. So as Ngugi Thiong'o writes, colonization involves the destruction or the deliberate undervaluing of a people's culture, their arts, dances, religions, history, geography, education, orature, and literature. So Ngugi is talking about the African context, specifically Kenya, but this really applies more generally. So in the African context, for example, in Kenya, colonialism took a particular form, which wasn't about the occupation of the land, but rather it was about an exploitation of the resources of the land. And what that meant is that what role does the native population play in this? Well, in this type of colonization, the Indigenous population is necessary because they are the labor. And in fact, sometimes the labor is the material that is being extracted. And so in that case, part of the way in which this is justified is by this elevation of colonial knowledge system, these Western knowledge systems as default, as this is the way to be, and the way that the culture and the traditions and the knowledge systems of Indigenous communities are devalued precisely in order to justify the exploitation of people for the labor. So that's an example of exploitation colonization. There's also settler colonialism, which is characteristic of what happened here in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, where the actual point of colonization ended up being occupation of the land itself, and along with that, an elimination of Indigenous peoples. And even there as well, there's the colonial imperative to devalue the knowledge systems and the ways of life of Indigenous people. And again, along with that is this elevation of colonial knowledge systems, Western knowledge systems, so the knowledge systems that we engage with, as being default and as being neutral. And certainly a main promoter of this idea of Western knowledge systems as superior is the academy. It is institutions such as universities and museums and other forms of knowledge distribution. And Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who's a Maori scholar from New Zealand, writes that it is surely difficult to discuss research methodology and Indigenous people together in the same breath without having an analysis of imperialism, without understanding the complex ways in which the pursuit of knowledge is deeply embedded in multiple layers of imperial and colonial practices. So again, there is this idea that we can't take for granted the way that we do things as default, because any work that we do with Indigenous communities is intimately tied with colonization, not just historically, but also in the present moment. So if we want to interrupt these cycles, if we want to contribute to the undoing of the effects of colonization, part of what we need to do in the academy, if we're going to take these ideas seriously, is to interrogate some of these assumptions that are taken for granted. For us, it's assumptions about what counts as language, what does it mean to have a language, what is a speaker. We take for granted a lot of these assumptions in the work that we do. And I think many of those are based on these Western ways of thinking that are based on colonial logics. So decolonization necessitates this interrogation, and along with that, an elevation of non-Western knowledge systems. So Indigenous knowledge systems, not simply as an object of study or a curiosity, but as something that we engage with on an equal footing that we believe can inform our own way of thinking. So this applies to linguistics, I think, very precisely. So what I've been talking about has been more general. What these other scholars have been discussing is more general about the academy, but certainly linguistics is not immune to that in any way. So there are several scholars who have talked about how the history of linguistic work in the Americas is inextricably linked to the colonial legacy. So if we imagine what was the first work that was done on Indigenous languages of the America, it was all for the purposes of the empire, for religious, economic or cultural imperatives. So here I'm thinking of, some of the earliest work that was done by missionaries. And what was the purpose of the missionaries? Well, they needed to come in and they needed to master the languages in order to be able to convert the Indigenous people to Christianity. So that type of linguistic work was intentionally extractive. It meant to draw from communities for the purposes of the empire. So what did that work look like? Well, the colonial linguist went into an oppressed community. They accessed and recorded the knowledge of Indigenous people. They then analyzed it and synthesized it, and then they presented it in a format that served the empire. For example, in the form of these grammars that were then used for missionary purposes. What I want to point out is that, yes, this is the history of linguistics, the colonial history of linguistics, but that this model is essentially the one that many of us can still connect to. So what does a lot of work with Indigenous communities look like these days? Well, we go into the community, we have this idea in mind of some particular material that we want to extract, a verbal paradigm, tokens of pronunciation or whatever. We access and we record that knowledge. We go back and we analyze it and synthesize it using our own theories and methodologies, and then we present it in a format that serves the academy. So these journal articles, for example, that are really inaccessible to the communities themselves, that really are meant to serve only the academy. So what I'm saying is that, yes, we have a legacy of colonization in linguistics, but also this informs the way that we operate today. So if we are to take this idea of decolonization seriously, I think there's a few key ideas for us to keep in mind as we think about what that might look like. So one of them is this interrogation of the assumptions of Western knowledge systems, so that we don't take for granted some of these assumptions about what counts as language, how should it be studied, how can we subdivide components of language to different levels of structure of language. And that we also make room for Indigenous knowledge systems, that we take seriously the way that people talk about their language in ways that are not simply this sort of, oh, look how cute, look how quaint, but really sort of consider that as valid knowledge as well. think it also involves this acknowledgement that a lot of this linguistic work is driven by academic goals, so that this model is still in place, that engagement with communities is a lot about what the goals of the academic is, and that results in this sort of unidirectional flow of resources from the community to the academy. And so decolonization involves an interruption of this unidirectional flow, which involves returning of power and resources and a ceding of privileges, which is, I think, a key part of many, especially activist perspectives of decolonization. So I don't mean to suggest that there hasn't been any of this type of work being done in linguistics, because in fact, I think that there are many decolonial elements in the ways in which we've been thinking about language for the last few decades. So there have been many arguments for more ethical work with communities. So Karen Rice has a paper on ethical engagement with communities. And in fact, we include this, for example, in field methods classes. We do talk about how to be more ethical with communities. We do talk about not disrupting the dynamics that are happening in a community. And I think all that is great, and all that does contribute to decolonization because it does allow for an interruption of this unidirectional flow. Other work that has already been done in linguistics that has moved towards decolonization have been some of these theoretical frameworks for understanding how we do community-based work. So there's community-based language research and language reclamation. I'll talk about those two in a little bit more detail. But the idea is that, it's not as though we're starting from zero. We've already been thinking about ways of engaging with communities, especially Indigenous communities, in ways that are what I would call more decolonial, even if that term is not what's being used to describe the work. So Ewa Ciałkowska-Higgins has a paper where she talks about community-based language research, and she offers a framework for understanding different type of work with communities. And she highlights the fact that there's different levels of engagement with communities. So we can have some models that range from models that are still ethical but continue to be linguist-based. So this would be something where a linguist goes into a community and seeks to gather information and does it in an ethical way, builds the appropriate relationships, compensates appropriately. But the project is still completely driven by the linguist, by the research questions of the linguist, by the theories, by the methodologies of the linguist. So that's one model on one end. And then we have a continuum that goes all the way through to models that really sort of focus on advocacy and empowerment. So community-based language research, Ciałkowska-Higgins offers this heuristic for understanding when work really is engaging in meaningful collaborative ways. So community-based language research that does this kind of meaningful engagement with communities that would be what I would call, based on some decolonial principles, is research that is on a language and is conducted for, with, and by the language-speaking community within which the research takes place and which it affects. So it really gives a lot more agency to the communities themselves. And so that's sort of one end of the spectrum. Wesley Leonard also talks about language reclamation, and he defines language reclamation as a larger effort by a community to claim its right to speak a language and to set associated goals in response to community needs and perspectives. And he deliberately talks about how this differs from the focus of language revitalization that we might think as being more conventional. So this is a vision of language revitalization that's based on primarily intergenerational transmission of grammatical fluency. So a lot of our scales of language vitality, so if we think of like the EGIDS or the UNESCO scale, a language is graded in terms of its vitality, and one of the prime measures for it is whether there's intergenerational transmission of grammatical fluency. So that is a goal that a lot of communities have in mind, but it's not necessarily the only goal, and sometimes it's not a goal of the community, and often it's not the primary goal of the community, and it doesn't take into account the actual situation of the community. So for language reclamation, for us to talk about language reclamation, it's something that is set by the community itself, which may include increasing, young speakers, children learning the language, but it may also include other ways of engaging with the language that are responsive to the local needs. So a community may not be able to really sort of capitalize on intergenerational transmission of grammatical fluency, but they may have, may want to preserve the language in these other ways. So for cultural, for religious purposes. So the community gets to set what those goals are, which may include intergenerational transmission, but may not even be the primary goal. So I do think that these community-based projects that I'm talking about offer more just and equitable models of engaging with Indigenous communities. I think this is actually something that has been happening that is taking us towards decolonization. But what I want to do is take sort of a bird's eye view of how these projects sit within the academy. So I'm thinking of projects, for example, what changes and what doesn't change about the way that the academy is structured. And so the kind of scenario that I'm picturing is one that I've engaged with and, to a certain extent, continue to engage with that is quite common, which is one where the linguist has a particular idea driven by some sort of theoretical impetus for, you want to prove some sort of theory, right? Or you want to challenge this other theory. You want to connect with the field as the field conceptualizes linguistics. And what you do is you go into a community and you get their verbal paradigm because you need it in order to sort of support your theory. You follow this conventional model of going into the community, analyzing and synthesizing and producing something that is not meant for the community. But while you're there, you build relationships with the community and say someone in the community says, "Hey, you're a linguist. Can you help us out? Can you help us out with what we'd like to do is develop a children's book that is based on a cultural story." You say, "Great, I have these skills, I can help you out." A nice collaboration ensues, and then you have this nice little product that's distributed to some families that they use then to teach the language to their child. So this is one that sort of does have a community-based component to it, and I think that community-based component does increase justice and equity, does sort of move us towards decolonization. But what I want to think about, and this is something that I've experienced quite personally in my last few years here, is what is rewarded? What is considered to be like the valued work of linguistics? And I think at all levels, it's these peer-reviewed academic papers in prestigious journals. They continue to be the gold standard for jobs, for promotion, for tenure. It is these papers that are inaccessible to the communities. It is these papers that are built on an extractive model where the flow of information goes from the community to the academy that continue to be the measures by which we determine whether someone deserves to stay in the academy. This other work, the work that directly supports communities, for example, through pedagogical materials and cultural resources, is generally considered supplemental or secondary. It was the case with me that a lot of this work was nice. It's nice that you're doing it. This is good service. We're glad that you're doing this service for the community, but it isn't considered to have the same type of intellectual merit as these technical articles that, again, are basically inaccessible to the community. And I would even point out are often inaccessible to other linguists who are not trained in particular theories and methodologies. So these technical papers are often targeted to a very, very narrow audience. So what I'm arguing is that if we want to take the next step towards decolonization, we need to change not just the process of research, but also the products of research. So it's not enough to be more ethical in our engagement with communities if the products based on instruction continue to be incentivized. So I think a key idea of any system, I used to teach elementary school, and it's always true that the things that get rewarded allow the system to reproduce itself. And I think that if we have these products that continue to be based on this extractive model, what does that mean? It means that we're going to continue to reproduce a system that is based on these extractive logics of the colonialism. So a key to decolonization is to not participate in the production of these extractive products. So I am saying something rather extreme, and I definitely want to interrogate that a little bit further. What do I mean by that? What do I not mean by that? But I think one thing that I do mean by that is that what we incentivize is what reproduces the system, and that what we currently incentivize are products that are based on extraction of knowledge, a one unidirectional flow of knowledge from communities to the academy. So again, what I'm talking about is not a minor thing. If I'm talking about not participating in the creation of extractive products, and these are the extractive products, these are the products that are valued as a gold standard by the academy. This is a big task. In order to support us in that, I'm I'm bringing in this concept of refusal. So refusal does mean what we think it means. It means a saying no, but I'm engaging with the construct of refusal as a theoretical construct. So this is something that comes from anthropology and indigenous studies, especially the work of Audra Simpson in her book, Mohawk Interruptus. And so Simpson frames refusal as this theoretical construct that involves a rejection of conventional modes of recognition. So for Simpson and for others that are engaging with refusal in this way, it's not simply saying no. It's meant to be this generative process that engages with alternative methodologies, epistemologies, and value systems. So if we are to use refusal as something that supports us in our work, we have to come from what Simpson calls a productive place of refusal. So what does that look like? So I want to offer an example. This example is actually from her book that I think is a good way of understanding what is meant by this idea of a generative place of refusal, a productive place of refusal, a refusal as a generative process, one that does actually include this saying no, but saying no for the purpose of opening up other opportunities. So the example that is in Simpson's book is involves the Iroquois Nationals lacrosse team from the Haudenosaunee Nation. And this involves an incident in 2010. So the Iroquois National Lacrosse team was supposed to compete in the World Lacrosse League Championship in England. And this is relevant because lacrosse was invented by the Haudenosaunee. So, this is sort of their sport that was then sort of spread to other communities. So they were going to participate in this championship, but they couldn't enter the country because the United Kingdom wouldn't recognize their Haudenosaunee passports. Now, this is despite there being treaties between the British Empire and the Haudenosaunee that recognizes Haudenosaunee citizenship. So one option that the team would have been to use their Canadian or US passports. Haudenosaunee Nation is located in Canada and the United States. So these individuals would have been entitled to Canadian or American passports. But instead they opted to refuse to do that. Instead, they said, we are going to use only our Haudenosaunee passports. We are going to refuse to engage in, they are going to both metaphorically and literally, they refused to play the game. They did not want to participate in these conventional modes of recognition that devalued their Haudenosaunee citizenship. So this was an act of refusal. So it was an act of saying no, but it was also meant to be a generative process of opening up possibilities for other modes of recognition. And in fact, this is the effect that it had. So it reinforced the political sovereignty of the Haudenosaunee, which is guaranteed through these treaties and through the history of the Haudenosaunee. It reinforced this notion of political sovereignty for themselves and for their community, and relevantly, of course, for the outside world. Practically, the news coverage that ensued highlighted the historical and contemporary presence of the Haudenosaunee and their land. So this is an example of how an act of refusal opened up other possibilities for growth, both for the community itself, but also for larger conversations about the way that nations deal with indigenous communities, indigenous nations. So what would refusal look like in academia? So I will quote Tuck and Yang, who write a lot about decolonization, and they say that refusal and stances of refusal in research are attempts to place limits on conquest and colonization of knowledge by marking off what is off limits, what is not up for grabs, what is sacred, what can't be known. So again, there is this notion of saying no to something, of setting boundaries. So for communities, that part of this means setting boundaries with regard to, what outsiders can do and what cannot do. And for academics, it means a ceding of privileges and saying, I will not produce these conventional products that are based on extraction. So I want to offer a little bit of an example from an experience that has happened to me quite recently. So there's a Northern Paiute community that wants to develop, that received a grant to develop a curriculum for the K-12 system for the Paiute language, and they asked me to be a consultant in that. So of course I said, sure, I'd love to do that, and they put a salary in there, summer salary in there for me. So because of that, the tribe ended up having to work with the university, and things were going fine until there was this clause that there was a significant disagreement about, which had to do with a clause that the tribe wanted that any materials that were produced through the process of this grant, that the tribal community had to approve anything that would be published from that. So the university, the person that was sort of representing the university, it was not having any of that, saying, no, this is a university, this is what we do, we have to publish this material. And that person was speaking on my behalf because I would be paid through the university. But in the end, we decided that the tribe had the tribe was going to retain that ability to approve or disapprove of anything that gets published. So that's an example of refusal on the part of the community, where they set boundaries on what kind of knowledge may be used and in what way. And for me as an academic, that meant that I had to not fight that I had to cede this privilege, that the university had to say, okay, you have this last say over that. So that's an example of refusal in terms of both the way that the community does it, but also the way that the academic does it as well. There is a power imbalance, and we need to recognize that as academics, we often stand on the sort of the power and the more powerful end of that. So what I'm pointing out is that the products as they exist now are essential to the reward systems that reproduce colonial structures. Again, what gets rewarded gets reproduced. And so if we want to enact decolonization, we need to target the products and not just the process. That's the only way in which we're going to actually change the colonial structures. So I'm going to talk about what that may look like in just a bit, but I do want to mention, again, I alluded to this idea of power, and that enacting refusal is not something that can be enacted by people equally. Those with the least privilege face the greatest consequences. So those with the least privilege, the people that have more precarity in the academy, graduate students, junior faculty, contingent faculty, they first of all have the least clout, so it's going to be harder for them to actually affect this larger change, but they also face the greatest consequences. They could be excluded from the academy, and where I stand right now is I'm somewhat in the middle, so I definitely have a secure position right now, but I'm pre-tenure, which means that anything could happen with tenure, depending on the way that my work is going to be received. So I see both sides of it, where I can certainly protect graduate students and undergraduates that are engaging in this work, but I'm also not sort of at the top end of it. So I can see sort of both sides of the way that this would work. So I do think that, it's important for us to still continue to be practical. And what this means is that incremental change may be a practical need, especially for those who are most vulnerable. But I do want to continue to stress that just because this may be a practical necessity doesn't mean that we should give up on this idea that in order to truly engage with decolonization, we need to change the way that we reward individuals in the academy. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which what that may look like, and I want to offer a few guiding principles to consider as we think about whether or not we want to engage with decolonizing the academy generally, but linguistics specifically. And so one of these is that acknowledging colonial structures in linguistics. Another one is building on existing decolonial work. And the third one, which is sort of the visionary one, is replacing colonial structures with decolonial frameworks and expectations. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn as just some things that I have thought about as guiding principles for making the choices that we make as we endeavor to embark on this notion of decolonizing the field of linguistics. So the first thing I'll talk about is acknowledging colonial structures. And I think that because the colonial legacy is generally invisible, certainly it's not something that we're very aware of. However, it permeates theories and methods everywhere. So as I said, we essentially have this extractive model that is based on the way that research was conducted in colonial times. Simply recognizing our conventional products as extractive can be very, very powerful. So for one, it validates the experiences of Indigenous people who mistrust academia. And there are many examples of this, of Indigenous communities that are, that don't want to engage with researchers because of this history. I experienced that myself, that when I first came here, there was a little bit, people were happy to sort of have me take the classes and to come to events, but there was some hesitation about embarking on projects with me because they had this experience before of people, they thought that I would come in here, do work that I needed, and then leave to make a name for myself, or, for something that would serve my purposes. This is something that was thought about the work that I did, understandably so, because this has been the experience of Indigenous people, across the world. Also, acknowledging these colonial structures allows us to target precisely those research practices that reinforce colonial approaches. So I'm certainly not arguing that every part of research is extractive, but if we consider that there are extractive elements in our research practices, we can consider, well, which ones and in what way, and that allows us to target, that allows us to make the modifications that we need to actually seek to undo some of these effects of colonization. I also want to stress that because the academy is inherently a colonial institution, all of us are set up to be complicit in the replication of colonial structures. This isn't about individuals. I mean, this goes back to this idea that's again sort of things that are being talked about more now, that, for example, racism is structural, that it isn't about the behaviors of individual people. That does matter, but that if you change individual behaviors without changing the structure, it'll all sort of get reproduced again. So our good intentions and strong personal relationships with community members are not sufficient to undo these structures. They're good things to do, obviously, if we want to engage more ethically with communities. But if we want to contribute to decolonization, we really need to target the structures themselves. I think this acknowledgement of the colonial legacy of the field requires an honest reflection on the effects of our work. So some things to think about: in what ways does my work take from communities? Who does and doesn't benefit from my work? Who does and doesn't have access to what I produce? And I do think this is something that we engage in personally. But again, it isn't about changing simply the individual, it's about changing the structures. So we do this not to sort of flagellate ourselves and say, oh, look at the ways in which I'm not serving communities. We do it to this larger purpose of addressing these colonial structures. So acknowledging that these colonial structures are at play also allows us to address the challenges that come with enacting decolonization. So as I said, this is not an easy thing to do, and it does come with a lot of risks. So I definitely believe that sometimes it's necessary to produce one of these products that are based on extraction for practical purposes. But if this is necessary, then one thing we can do is recognize that it's only for the short term, that we're doing it for expedience, not because recognizing that there's larger work to be done later once we have a little bit more security. And I think even at all levels, we can add some kind of decolonial component to the work that we do. So again, I'll offer an example from something that I have encountered. I'm working with a graduate student. So this is a graduate student in anthropology. So not someone in, I'm not the chair of this person's committee, but I am the external member. And so this person came to me because they wanted me to, they wanted these ideas of decolonization. They wanted to engage with the communities in a more ethical way. And I said, sure, I'll be on your committee. But the tension, of course, is that the expectation of the other members of the committee is that this person produced archaeological work the way that all archaeological work has been produced, and in ways that support narratives that Indigenous communities challenge. So what we came up with in our discussion was, this person was going to continue to do this sort of archaeological work and using the methods and frameworks that the other members of the committee wanted, but this person was also going to have a chapter that engages with Indigenous conceptualizations of their own history. So this is a small decolonial component of an otherwise very conventional structure, but I do think this decolonial component is a step towards decolonization that will contribute to this larger changing of the structures. So being aware of the colonial structures also lets us think about alternative ways of achieving our ultimate goals. So if our goal is to support language projects and communities, certainly it's nice to have academic credentials, but it's not necessary to. So if we're clear about what our ultimate goals are, we can also be clear about to what extent do we actually need to produce these products. I think it's also important to find allies, both locally and more broadly. So people that are more senior to one, that are supportive of these decolonial endeavors, again, both in one's institution, but also more broadly, because there's a lot of these intellectual trends that are going cross-disciplinarily, and that also involves leveraging existing work for support. I'm going to talk about both of these in a little bit more detail in the next slide. Which involves this other guiding principle that I've sort of been working with, is that we can build on existing decolonial work. So as I pointed out, we have already been engaging with principles of decolonization in linguistics as we think about working more ethically with marginalized communities. So one thing we can do is find publications that engage with this kind of work, even those that don't necessarily call it decolonization. We can read them and let that inform our way of thinking, our engagement with theory, with methodology. and we can cite them. And I think this last part about citing them is important because increasing visibility of Indigenous communities, of marginalized scholars is important. And one of the ways in which we can increase their visibility is through citation. This is one of the tools of the Academy for visibility. So we can find venues where such work is published or presented. So here I just offer a few that I have found to be productive places to engage with. So one of them is the journal Language Documentation and Conservation, which has published about some projects that I would say are oriented towards decolonization. Some of them use that term, some of them don't. There's SAIL, which is a symposium on American Indian languages, which I've been going to for the last few years. And what I find relevant about SAIL is that they include Indigenous voices in a very meaningful way. So yes, there is Indigenous programming throughout the schedule, but also a lot of scholars bring in their Indigenous collaborators as co-authors, and not just to stand next to them, but they actually also speak. And the way that the Indigenous community members speak is very different from the way that academics speak. And they're up there as authorities as well. And what it does is it creates this environment that really does value Indigenous voices. I think this is a space where decolonization is happening. As we know, decolonization is in the air. Even the flagship journal of the LSA, Language, has a new language revitalization section that is open to alternative ways about thinking of work with communities. So I think these venues are useful for finding this decolonization work that we can use to support our own ideas, but also these are useful venues to publish and present our own work, especially work that doesn't follow a lot of these conventional models. So I've been talking about building on existing decolonial work in linguistics, which obviously is important if we're linguists, but it's also, a lot of my ideas came from engaging with interdisciplinary work. So these sort of silos that we have of linguistics being different from anthropology, being different from ethnic studies, being different from education, these are also sort of colonial structures. So the more that we can look beyond these artificial boundaries, the more we can be informed by people that are doing work that in some ways is actually ahead of us. We have a lot to learn from other adjacent disciplines that really have been thinking about this for a little bit longer. And if we're thinking about breaking down boundaries, why not look outside the academy? So if we're thinking about decolonization specifically, there's lots of activist resources out there. There are people that are engaging, that are presenting their work in non-academic forums, YouTube, blogs, things like that. So I think that's one way in which we can do that. And then this next bullet point is about the ways in which we can be strategic about this work. So one of the things that I have found in my own experience is that some of this work is not legible to the colonial institutions. In other words, they don't view this as work that's necessarily valuable. They view it as like nice work, but who wants to be called nice? They view it as work that is of service to the community, fantastic, but they don't view it as engagement with scholarly ideas. So one of the ways in which I've found to be useful is to build on what other people have done before. So one of the things that I've done is expand on these existing notions. So for example, peer review is one of the sort of hallmarks of academic work. And I think there's some value to that because what peer review says is that the work that gets disseminated is work that has been vetted by other people in the community. So if we're addressing others in the linguistic community, we also, it's good for them to have a say in what gets circulated. So I think that's not a terrible idea. The problem with peer review is the way in which it is actually carried out. So who counts as in peer review as people that are considered to be experts? But if we're looking at Indigenous languages, for example, why don't we include Indigenous community members as part of this peer review process? So this is one way in which we can take a notion that already exists and really interrogate what we mean by that and what value it has. And if we determine that it has value, we can think about ways of expanding that. Something else that I found helpful for making my work legible is to frame my work using existing structures that have been theorized on. And this is why I talk about community-based language research and language reclamation as theories, because they are theories, first of all. But talking about theories as a way of supporting the work that we do is something that is understandable by people in the academy. So let's build on this work that's been done. Let's cite. I mean, I cite these authors. This is part of the currency of the academy. So use the currency of the academy, especially decolonial work that already exists, as a way of supporting this type of decolonial work. And the last thing I mentioned here is the rhetoric, use the rhetoric of the institutions. So a lot of university mission statements already had notions of engagement with the community, of diversity, equity, inclusion, and if they didn't, they now do. My university, for example, really prides itself on being a land grant institution. And although the history of land grant institutions is actually quite complicated with regard to Indigenous people, the way that it's viewed by the institution is as we're an institution that engages with the community, that we're all about place, we're all about this location. So I say, wait, great. If you're all about this place and this location, look at the work that I'm doing. Look at how it engages with place and location. I've also found it useful to use statements that are put out by the Linguistic Society of America. So for example, there's a statement that they have put out about the intellectual merit of language documentation. So work that simply documents languages and doesn't apply theories to them. That's also something that I think is useful to say, look, other institutions are valuing this. The LSA also has a statement on the race and racism in linguistics. And I think these are things that are important to sort of say, look, other people in institutions that are also colonial institutions are engaging with this work as well. And I think that makes this decolonial work more legible to these institutions that are still very much founded on colonial logics. And so this point about replacing colonial structures, this is about having a vision. I think that if we engage with decolonization, and I've talked about refusal as the things that we don't do, but I've also mentioned that refusal is an opportunity to engage with alternative epistemologies, research questions, and methodologies. So if we are engaging with decolonization, it actually allows us to rethink everything, to think, what are new possibilities? If we give up on these sort of colonial expectations that are based on these extractive models, how can we reconceptualize our theories? How can our theories be more responsive to communities and therefore be more expansive in the way that we think about things? So part of this involves reconceptualizing these existing structures. I already talked about that with regard to peer review, that if you do think, okay, there's a colonial legacy in the field, not just in the field, in the academy, and it permeates everything that we do, how can we interrogate these structures that we have and say, what is of worth and what is not? What is supportive of a generation of knowledge and what is not? And we can reconceptualize them in ways that are actually more inclusive and more expansive. This necessarily involves elevating Indigenous voices and voices of other marginalized communities. So one thing is including collaborators as co-authors. So it's one way to counter this privilege given to academics. And as I talked about before, when I mentioned SAIL, the Symposium on American Indian Languages, when you do allow Indigenous voices to speak from their own perspective, it changes the conversation, it changes the dynamic. And I think that this then allows space for frameworks that are based on non-Western traditions. So for example, I have seen some work by Indigenous linguists. So for example, Carrie Chu has a paper on language revitalization as using the metaphor of weaving. Melvitha Chi, who's a Diné scholar at the University of New Mexico, works on her native Navajo language, and I've seen her give a description of the Navajo verbal system using cultural metaphors that are appropriate to the Navajo people. So I think these allow for a linguistics that is more inclusive and more expansive. So I'm just going to offer a couple of concluding summary thoughts, some of the main points that I hoped to highlight in the presentation. So one is this idea that linguistics has a deep colonial legacy and relevantly, not just sort of this history, but also that continues to be enacted in our contemporary work in ways that we just take for granted. This is simply the way that things are done, but it's really based on a particular logic that comes from colonization. And that includes the fact that the products that are most valued by the Academy, these sort of very technical articles that go in these peer-reviewed journals that are really inaccessible to most people, again, even many linguists, that these are fundamentally based on an extractive model. And it's relevant, of course, that these products are the basis of our reward system. Because they continue to be the gold standard, they're going to continue to be reproduced. And what that means is that we're replicating colonial structures. So if we want to interrupt that, I think one way to do that is to engage with the concept of decolonization, because that is what it's about. It's about interrupting the replication of these structures. We don't have to start this from scratch. There has already been work in linguistics that encourages decolonization. So this work these models where we are engaging with communities more deeply, that is part of decolonization. But what I'm arguing is that we don't want to stop there. We don't want it to be simply about stopping the production of, helping communities with their own projects. We also need to be aware that the targets, that the products that we produce continue to replicate the structure. So if we really, really want to meaningfully change the colonial structures, we also have to target the products. So that's not an easy thing to do. So I think we need to bring in whatever resources we can. And for me, theoretically and intellectually, this notion of refusal is one construct that can be very helpful for doing so. So again, refusal, not simply being a no, but being a no in the service of opening up other opportunities. This necessitates being intentional about how we gather knowledge and what we do with that knowledge. And again, there's always this recognition that this is a risky endeavor. We are challenging the prevailing structures. So a few things that we need to keep in mind with this is that it's important to work incrementally if necessary, particularly if we're more vulnerable, to include some sort of decolonial component to it, but to recognize that we don't want to stop there. So I think, again, lots of land acknowledgements is something that's now new, that's really sort of everywhere. And I think that is a step towards decolonization. But if we stop there, okay, that's not actually going to get us very far. So recognize that the work can be incremental. We're taking this step now, and then consider what will the next step be. I think it's important to find community. Both in terms of finding actual support on the ground for decolonial work, but also intellectual community. And finally, to be strategic. So we do want to think about the larger structures, the impact that they have on individuals. We do want to think about what positions we have and what ways we can contribute to this. And we want to support other people that are doing that work if we ourselves are not able necessarily to engage in that. So these are just some of the thoughts that I have. I'm very happy and eager to hear what your thoughts are on all of this. So this is in the Northern Paiute language, Pishama. Thank you very much. And I'm eager to hear what discussion might ensue from this.
All right, thank you very much, Ignacio, for your talk. Let's give a round of applause, I think, or an emoji of applause, whatever you prefer. So now we'll open the floor for questions. We have until about 3:30, so you can feel free to use the raise hand function or to leave your question in the chat. Yes, Dr. Otegi.
Ignacio, it's nice to see you again, and nice to
you too.
Nice to see you doing so well. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I wanted to understand a little better the scope of what you are thinking. You've used terms like the inherent coloniality of the academy and the inherent coloniality of linguistics. But all your examples really have to do, I think all of them, with linguists doing linguistics on the basis of languages spoken by people who are very direct descendants of victims of colonization. And it leaves the impression, and my question is this impression intended, that linguists who are, for example, working on English, and they're interested in a topic of theoretical concern, and all their data comes from English, perhaps something from French, and the data is perhaps mostly intuitional, they haven't extracted it from anyone. Is there any coloniality in that kind of linguistics?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, I mean, you're absolutely right in that I narrowed my focus. The reason I narrowed my focus is partly one of the sort of elements of being strategic. So whenever I talk to individuals from well, again, I'm in an English department, so individuals from my department from other areas, I always try to say, well, let me offer an example from linguistics. But I don't mean just linguistics, and I sort of say that. I don't mean just linguistics. Here's my example. What I want you to do is consider the ways in which your own work also replicates colonial structures. So I definitely target my, I narrow my scope because that's what I can speak on from personal experience, from engaging with the literature. And that's one of the ways in which I'm strategic, but I definitely do not mean for it to be limited that way. So yeah, you offer sort of this counterexample that really does, it undoes everything that, not undoes everything that I do, but it's the things that I'm talking about are not really focusing on that, except for the fact that I think that this work continues to replicate a model. For example, work that the fact that English is the dominant language that's studied for anything, for semantics, for syntax, that alone, the fact that what we're doing is privileging English as the model of the language, I think that is one of the ways that is also based on these colonial logics of the superiority of, well, in this case, English, but really Western European languages. And in fact, I would say that if you look at the examples in textbooks or the examples, particularly in, I would say, semantics or syntax, these examples all come from English. So the ways in which they are, so in some ways, like the task of interrogating whether or not semantics and syntax, I would like the people that are in those areas to interrogate it, but I do have some starting points for them to consider. One is that the choices of the languages that they choose to set up as examples or that they choose to study, those choices also have an impact on what is viewed as valid knowledge in the field. So I think that's one thing that I would offer to a syntactician or a semanticist that's doing this work on English from material that wasn't gathered in an extractive way, is to say, well, think about the choices that you make and how are those contributing to the colonial logics of the superiority of Western knowledge. I think even in something like English, certainly there are people that are engaging. So, and also, what are you counting as English? And actually, I would say that this I learned from you, Ricardo, but this idea of like what counts as a language, even this notion of having something like English as a bounded entity, this is also based on these sort of Western colonial logics. So what are ways in which work that is, isn't drawn from indigenous communities? What are ways in which that can be also replicating colonial structures? What are ways in which those can still be based on these models of Western superiority? And I think that the answer is there are many, many ways of doing that. The volume that I talked about, Decolonizing Linguistics, there is actually a chapter in there that specifically deals with theoretical syntax and the ways in which theoretical syntax also, these theoretical syntax that we might think, oh, these are not extractive by any means whatsoever. There is a chapter that's talking about how theoretical syntax also needs to contend with its the ways in which it perpetuates colonial logics. So absolutely, I think that work needs to be done by those individuals, and it's going to look different from the way that I'm talking about it. And yeah, that for me was a strategic scope choice. I think the scope is narrow for me because this is something. This is my incremental work, but I definitely don't think that people that do this abstract theoretical linguistic work, such as this formal syntax, I don't think they're off the hook at all.
We have a question in the chat. Gabriela Veronelli asks, what would refusal look like for people who don't have a memory of indigenous languages?
So for who don't have a memory of indigenous languages, so do you mean an individual who has an indigenous background but doesn't have a connection to their indigenous language?
Not necessarily, but people who are colonized. And part of their colonization has been, they're really not just taking of the language, but also naturalization, say, of colonial languages. I'm trying to speak from the position of mestizos in Latin America, perhaps, and trying to bring Latin American studies to the discussion. So I just was wondering what that question will mean to you, and maybe also thinking if we could question what indigenous languages means, or if that's part of work that are you interested in, or you have come across. So that it's a very, I'm very curious. I'm very curious about, I want to pick your head. So I stop here.
Right. So actually, one thing that I do allude to in the chapter that this talk is based on, and that we talk about in the volume as a whole, is the fact that there are these different understandings of decolonization because they're based on different ways in which colonization has happened. So the situation is different with indigeneity in the United States is very different from indigeneity in Latin America because the history of colonization has been different in both of these contexts. So I think the first thing that I would say is that these notions of decolonization is the specific things that I have been talking about probably do need to be modified for the Latin American context, because my ideas are based on a particular understanding of colonization, which is this sort of settler colonial experience with this marking off of reservations and with this deliberate assimilation of indigenous communities through boarding schools, for example. So that's where my thinking is based on. In that situation, though there is definitely a strong overlap in Latin America, it is not exactly the same. So what I would say is, if someone were to engage with this, and they were starting with me as a starting point. So for example, if I were to continue this work with Latin American languages, I would start with some of the things that I am looking at as a starting point, and I would do the same kind of interrogation. So if I'm talking about the replication of colonial structures, and that one of the ways in which we reproduce this colonial structures is by othering the languages, is that something that also applies to the Latin American context? I would say yes. So that's definitely something that I would want to keep as part of this thinking. But in terms of the vibrancy of the languages in these communities, it is a different situation in the Latin American context than it is here. So there are very, very few people that I would identify as native speakers of Northern Paiute. And so their relationship to the language is actually it is one where I think this notion of language reclamation is relevant, because if we keep saying things like, you have to teach children the language, they have to learn it young, you have to have this immersion program. This is what I've seen happening, and that doesn't help communities, because the numbers that puts pressure on the elders, that puts a lot of shame on like the parent generation who haven't been teaching their children. So I think that's something that's very relevant to think about in the U.S. context, is the relationship of the people to their language based on the effects of colonization. That's a different situation in a lot of the communities in Latin America, where you do have these communities where the language is much more widely used. And so those kinds of ideas, I think you'd want to modify your understanding of decolonization if you were working with those communities, because the situation isn't the same as the situation that I'm talking about right now. And in terms of like you're talking about like a mestizo and how a mestizo would respond to that, I think that like our backgrounds do inform the kinds of choices that we make. So someone that is mestizo should probably also think about the ways in which the choices that they're making are informed by their own relationship to the colonial language, as well as their relationship to the indigenous language that was maybe part of their heritage but is no longer spoken. So I think these are questions that I think need to be engaged with. So the short answer is some of the things that I've talked about are going to apply to the Latin American context with mestizos, and some of them need to be modified because the context has some similarities, but the context also has some differences.
Okay, we have a question in the chat, and then we'll get to Juliet. So
Okay.
Grace in the chat asks or says, I was wondering if you might speak more to changes that might be made in graduate programs that might support decolonization work from much more junior researchers. You made an excellent point about there needing to be people in protected positions, needing to be leaders and allies. But are there ways that these very protected individuals and groups can re-envision course requirements, dissertation requirements, etc., in such a way that better encourages this work from the outset of someone's linguistic career?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is something that I think about when I work with students. So I don't, we have a graduate program in my department, but we don't have a ton of linguists in the graduate program. So much of my work comes from undergrad. So this is, I can sort of speak more to that. But I do work occasionally with graduate students. And I do think that part of it, again, this is sort of all incremental. So I think we probably do want to change the way that we consider the course requirements in general. This is probably something that should be done sort of generally. The field of linguistics is changing in general, not just sort of with regard to decolonization. So we probably want to continually ask those kinds of questions. But I think for me, so this involves like looking at coursework. And so this is something that I do even when I'm working with undergraduate students. And I certainly do not have this, energies are limited. So one area that I would like to do more work on is the way that I teach my classes. So I teach a syntax class, and I found a few small ways to bring in ideas of decolonization. So one of the ways in which I do it is by teaching alternative frameworks. So at UNR, generative syntax has been the way it's been taught all the time. And so when I got here, they said, "Can you teach this?" I'm like, "Well, I can teach it. It's what I was taught." But I didn't want to just sort of present it to students. So what I did is I brought in alternative frameworks that actually challenge a lot of these ideas of generative syntax. So what I've done is I've allowed students to question assumptions about theories and to show them the assumptions that we make about a particular theory shape the way that we do everything in that area. So think very carefully about the kinds of assumptions that you're doing. So I think that's partially a move towards decolonial work, but I don't include indigenous perspectives. I don't talk about marginalized communities in the way that they view language. So again, I think this is all incremental. So at the level of coursework, it is by bringing in these other voices, which again, the more we can do, the better. But, we also do sort of have to be practical. Where do we put our energies? So where I put my energies and where I would recommend, in a linguistics program to put our energies are on the choices that students can make about what they study. Is where we can sort of say, okay, you want to do work on this, with this indigenous community. What are ways in which you want to engage with a community that honors and respects what their needs are? What are ways in which you can let your work be guided? So the people that are doing this kind of supervision, I think that's a good place to allow for this sort of decolonization. So that's one of the things that I try to do when I work with students, is to give them more free rein on the kinds of questions that they ask, and also to question them, to say, why are you making this choice? Is there a way in which, ask them these kinds of questions. In what ways does your work take from communities? In what ways do you give back? So I think that this, at all levels, this can be looked at. And, it's good to start somewhere. My own sort of preferences would be to start on probably places where the formation is a little bit further, so dissertation level or the QPs that happen. But I think we should also probably look at coursework. But, again, it's about being strategic.
Okay. Grace says thank you. And Juliet, did you still wish to speak?
Yes, thank you. Ignacio, thank you for the wonderful, thought-provoking talk. I guess front and center of my thoughts are young people who identify as Indigenous people with native languages that they want to preserve or see spoken into the future. They're young, they have a lot of energy, and I've met so many of them around the world. And as an educator, I feel very guilty about suggesting, as bright and as able as they are, for them to go into a university system where they are studying linguistics at a graduate level, because it could destroy their lives. Because this is a colonial world and it's not their world, and they may need to leave their homeland and so on. So, being in New York City, we have places like the Endangered Language Alliance, which is trying to serve many different communities. But I'm just wondering whether you've thought about this issue and whether you think there is a place for people like us who are gathered here today to create community linguistics classes which are offered for free and which are a service we give to young people like this, and we give them with, you know, every ounce of strength that we would give to our own graduate students. But this would be, would this fit into your notion of decolonization?
Yes, absolutely. Because I do think, you know, so one of the notions that I bring forward in decolonization, or in thinking about colonization, is the unidirectional flow of resources. And so this actually interrupts that by changing it, by making it so that the flow of resources is from the academy to the communities. So I do think that this would be a really valuable step towards decolonization. And I agree with you. I mean, I do have undergrads that talk about they're interested in graduate school, and I am also hesitant to say, like, yes, because on the one hand, yes, we want you, we need your voices to be there, but I agree with you that this can destroy some people. So I try to, when I talk to them, I try to be very well, I don't say it in the words that I just said it, but I say these things. I say, your voice is very valuable. You have a lot that you can contribute. Just know that the structures are set up so that you're going to have to do X, Y, and Z. So this is the earlier question. You're going to have to take this class, this class, this class. You're going to have to produce this paper, this paper, this paper. How will that fit in with what your, how will that fit in with your own goals? So again, this is where I say, like, we need to be clear about our goals. If what they want to do is work on their language, and their goals are to work right away, to sort of help with development of dictionaries, they don't need the field of linguistics. But if their goals are to sort of contribute to the larger conversation with other scholars, then they might want to engage in that. So part of it is for them to clarify what their goals are. I think another part of it is to consider, well, yeah, the ways in which these interrupting the flow. So making sure that they're aware of what's happening, and that the structures are going to push them in a particular direction. So I think another thing for them to be aware of is, do you have a community that will support you, both your own home community, but also do you have a community in a particular institution that will support you? So I think this is the type of advice that I would give to people this is the type of advice I do give to people. This is undergrads that are interested in grad school, but this is the type of advice that I would give to any sort of community person that's really energetic about their language, thinking about ways in which the academy might and might not serve them, because it might not serve them. And I think that needs to be said at the outset, that's okay. That if you end up choosing not to do this because you have this other goal, that's okay. And that's a first step, I would say, towards decolonization. And I think the other thing that you mentioned is, yes, if we can find ways in which we can give back to these communities in ways that are no strings attached. Because I think one of the things that I find is, you know, the project that the model that I talked about, where we go in to do the work and then, oh, they tell us, can you help us with this? There's a string attached, you know, like there's a string attached in that I'm helping you with this, but I do need those tokens from you. So the more we can sort of disrupt that and say, this is just for you. We're putting as much energy, as you said, as we do for our own students. This is all just for you. That's another way of disrupting it. So I think, yeah, it's about approaching it from these different perspectives. It's about being honest with these young people who are interested in their language about what the academy can and cannot give them, and what the academy will expect of them. And I think that in terms of this other idea, it is to the extent that we can give with no strings attached and put in the same energy, that also disrupts the sort of the flow of resources in the academy.
Thanks again.
We have another question in the chat from Rachel. So Rachel says, how do we apply the framework of decolonization in work on endangered languages pressured by globalization and migration? Additionally, I see this tension between deconstructing this idea of a language and sometimes the necessary and strategic essentialism of language activism or advocacy. Do you think this could be reconciled? And if so, how could this be reconciled?
Yeah, great question. So let me look at the two-part question. So how do we apply the framework of decolonization work on endangered languages pressured by globalization and migration? Well, I mean, I think, again, we sort of apply the same kinds of principles. Are we talking about a unidirectional flow of resources? Are we talking about communities that don't have a say in the way that their work is being used? I think a lot of it does come to how much of a say do communities have in the way that their languages are being worked and being used. And I would say this is true regardless of the context. So, you know, whether we're talking about like these massive power differentials, the way that you find in indigenous communities, or whether you're talking about, I was recently at a conference in Catalonia. And so the situation of Catalan and Castilian there is, there's some similarities, obviously, but there's also the power differential isn't the same. However, we still want to ask the same types of questions. Who gets a say in the way that that choices about languages are being made? So I think the same types of questions apply to endangered languages that are pressured by globalization and migration. Who has a say in the way that we view these languages? And actually, even the way that I'm talking about it alludes to I think, one of the issues that you're raising in the second question, which is this essentialism of language, the essentialism of language, that we do have these notions of language as this is everywhere. Language as this, again, this sort of bound entity that can be possessed. And there's some work out there. Jane Hill, for example, has talked about the rhetoric that we use with regard to language revitalization, and some ways in which that rhetoric can be problematic. And I think that may be what you're alluding to, this sort of tension of saying like language isn't this bound entity that can be possessed, and yet this is the way that people in activism talk about it. So this is a fantastic question. It's actually something that I'm quite interested in, that I haven't fully reconciled yet. But again, I'm going to apply the kinds of principles that I have talked about now, that if this discussion of language essentialism, which again you definitely see even among members of indigenous communities, if we're talking about that community with this language, we sort of let them have the say. That if this is the way they're thinking of their language, we let their voice be heard. And yeah, we do want to consider the ways in which this essentialist view of language may be problematic in other ways. I think that's absolutely a question that we need to ask. Can it be reconciled? I think that's a great question. But I think in the short term, in these particular projects, if we're taking these principles of decolonization seriously, we let the communities speak, even if they're in ways that I think we might want to counter, such as this idea of language essentialism, which is something that I do want to counter. I want to counter it with my students. I want to counter it with these communities, but I also am being strategic about it. Again, going back to that idea that thinking about the language essentialism as it applies to these endangered languages, this may not be the time for it. This may be work to do sort of intellectually outside of our engagement with those communities, because I'm not sure they can be reconciled. But I think it's a great question to consider.
We probably have time for, yes, Dr. Otegi. Oh, you're muted.
Ignacio, I wanted to express a concern about what decolonialism or decolonizing logics are not, as a way to help me understand what they are. Mm-hmm. So my concern is that it may happen that every act of openness and questioning is seen as a decolonial, as a step towards towards a reduction of the colonial logic. So, for example, when you take intellectual issues such as language essentialism, or the idea of teaching different theories of some phenomenon, such as different theories of syntax in the study of language, I'm not sure that I understand how this kind of open-minded approach to certain topics, or a more strict approach to certain topics, can be any more or less colonial. My concern is that if every opening step is a decolonial step, then I won't know what decolonization really is. You see what it is that worries me?
This is absolutely a fantastic question. And I completely agree with you. And yes, I think So, speaking off the cuff, I tend to do this, which I think many of us do, but it's something that I actually really sort of do target in the chapter is absolutely, we do not want decolonization to be any kind of opening. I agree with you. And in fact, that is the way that decolonization is being talked about broadly. And yes, I throw that idea out as well. This is why we can talk about, for example, one of the things that I have an issue with is us talking about decolonizing the syllabus. When people say, oh, we're going to decolonize the syllabus, what does that mean? We're going to have assignments that are more open-ended. We're going to have more freedom with deadlines. We're going to include other authors. That's all fantastic. But I agree, that is not decolonization. And I also agree with you that having like what I talked about in my syntax class is also not decolonization. Me having alternative theories and questioning these things, that's also not decolonization, because it isn't actually giving voice to indigenous communities. And this is, again, my understanding of decolonization. It isn't actually sort of changing the structures. It's really sort of being, as you said, more open, more inclusive. So though, yes, I have used that term in this way, partially as a strategic thing, because I think start opening up the way that you think about, the way that you talk about language, and that will open up opportunities for what I do consider to be true decolonization, which is this this challenging of these Western ideas as fundamental and allowing room for indigenous voices, this disruption of the unidirectional flow of resources. So no, I don't think that including more indigenous authors is decolonizing the syllabus, but I do sort of think in terms of being strategic, that's not where I'm going to put my energy, is at targeting the people that are bringing in more indigenous authors into their syllabus, even though I agree with you, that isn't actually decolonization. That's not what I'm talking about. And even some of the examples that I gave, like my own syntax class, that's also not decolonization. I think it's maybe, I'm somewhat comfortable calling it a step towards decolonization, because it's a step towards opening up the possibility of decolonization. But yes, I absolutely agree. That is not decolonization, but I am comfortable with saying it's a step towards it. That it's, like a baby step we can take to maybe engage in this true decolonization, which involves the challenging of colonial structures, which involves the disruption of the unidirectional flow of information, which involves the challenging of Western ideas as superior and the subordination of indigenous ideas. So thanks for the clarification, because yeah, I absolutely agree. We want to be clear about that term, even if we are trying to support people in whatever steps they can take.
Okay, well, we have reached 3:30. Thank you, everybody, for the questions, for the lively discussion. Let's give Ignacio another round of applause for a wonderful talk and a wonderful Q&A.
Thank you all, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all. Again, my only regret is that I'm not there in person, but otherwise, this is fantastic.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone who came to our talks this semester. This is the final sociolinguistics lunch of the semester. I hope to see many of you again at our talks next semester. So thank you very much.